Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Shabazz Palaces, titled Lese Majesty. But first, let's talk a little bit about Sub Pop Records. Most prominently known for jumpstarting the grunge movement thanks to signing Soundgarden and Nirvana, they've also signed acts like Sonic Youth, The Postal Service, Beach House, Fleet Foxes, Sleater-Kinney, The Shins, and all manner of indie rock bands that have earned some pretty considerable critical acclaim over the past couple of years. In other words, like Top Dog Entertainment, they're a label that critics tend to keep their eyes on if they know what's best for them. But over the past few years, Sub Pop started doing something that's a little bit unusual for the label, signing hip-hop groups, mostly on the experimental, noisy, abrasive side of the genre. Now, one of these groups I've talked about before, Clipping, who dropped one of my favorite hip-hop records of this year thus far in terms of its noisy, yet very accessible sound and thought-provoking lyrics and production and themes. The other group, however, I've got a slightly more complicated relationship with, and it's also an act that I've got a very hard time making heads or tails of every single time that I listen to their records. Yep, I'm talking about Shabazz Palaces, who first burst on the scene with a pair of critically acclaimed EPs before dropping the absolutely fascinating record Black Up, an album I think I appreciate a lot more than I like. Now, the album is layered, excellently produced, and features some thought-provoking and intelligent lyrics and themes about approaching hip-hop in a different paradigm, but at the same time, I couldn't really call myself a real hardcore fan of that record. While I really love the jazz fusion with the noisy, off-kilter rhythms and psychedelia across the album, MC Ishmael Butler, aka Palicier Lazaro, didn't really impress me with his flow or his delivery or his energy, and I always found the free association lyrics didn't always stick the landing as effectively as they could, no matter how much desperate extrapolation was pulled off of Rap Genius. So okay, I was curious to take a look at their newest album, Lese Majesty, especially given that there's really little to no critical consensus on this album across the internet, especially on YouTube. So I took a look. How'd it turn out? Well, after over a dozen listens, I think I finally managed to come to a conclusion on this album. Lese Majesty by Shabazz Palaces is like a broken jigsaw puzzle. The pieces are scattered or barely linked together, or maybe even connecting at some points, but if you squint closely and fill in some of the gaps yourself, or maybe take a look at the picture on the box, you can see a pretty impressive picture. And yet despite that, you can't help but feel that that picture would be a lot more effective if the pieces were actually put together. In other words, while Lese Majesty by Shabazz Palaces is a broken, incohesive record, there are enough fascinating moments on this record that do make it worthwhile recommending for me. But at the same time, I can't help but feel that if it was actually assembled, it could have been a hell of a lot better. Before we actually start digging into the content of this album, let's get said structural issues out of the way first, otherwise they'll overshadow the entire review, because even if you're listening to this album as a single musical piece, which I would recommend, it's extremely fragmented. Not only are the tracks broken down to smaller and smaller pieces, with the average song just extending just under 2.5 minutes, some less than a minute, but the songs are also grouped together into suites that seem to suggest a loose thematic organization of sorts. Now, this is inevitably done in order to brush aside the unfortunate fact that large chunks of these little tracks just do not stand well on their own, and really should not have been separated off from the larger tracks as a whole, because when you break them off into their own tracks, most of them just become incredibly insubstantial and lacking in anything close to a developed musical idea, which honestly is a bit of a shame, because there are interesting instrumental elements here that could have deserved to be fleshed out a little bit more completely on a bit of a longer song on some of these fragments, and yet that rarely happens at all. Now, this takes us to the instrumentation and the production, where arguably the biggest shifts have taken place. The jazz, most of the industrial elements, these are mostly pushed aside in favor of these spacey, almost noisy electronics and psychedelic haze, which honestly isn't a bad choice, as I like both these shifts in principle, but while the thick, expansive mix creates a very potent, hazy mood, there just aren't a lot of melodic progressions that really grip me in the keyboards or in some of the blissed out guitar riffs. There are a few moments that I really do like. The off-kilter vocal samples eventually being supplanted by these gleaming synth lines on They Came in Gold, the eerie fade-out of Noetic Noiromatics, the cosmic brittleness of the Ballad of Lieutenant Major Winnings, the punchy ep-tempo mind glitch guitar TM theme, the interweaving almost lo-fi synths of Motion Sickness, but outside of these, many of the individual songs begin to run together or feel swallowed up in their own mix. Or like the guitars on Colluding Oligarchs, or the overloaded, drippy mix of New Black Wave, feature elements that are so dissonant with the rest of the track that they just draw all the wrong sorts of attention. Now this especially becomes true of the vocal production, which probably was not the best choice when you have an MC known for such slow, methodical, complex flow and delivery and vocabulary. And then you drown him in reverb and haze so you can barely make his rhymes out whatsoever. Now I get it, it's part of the atmosphere, it contributes to the overall alien feeling of the album, but it doesn't exactly help your record to obscure your biggest selling point. So okay, let's talk about those lyrics, shall we? Now, I was tempted, like with most psychedelic records, to eventually point out that at some point the lyrics, they're just gonna stop making sense. You're just gonna might as well ignore them. And you know what? Shabazz Palaces are gunning for that point in record time, with free association lyrics and pop culture references that often feel completely out of place and almost seem to be dumbing down some of their concepts, barely making any sense. The thing is, this album does start making sense when you look at the larger picture and the overarching narrative of this album. Now, like with many modern and experimental hip-hop records today, it's an album exploring the current state of modern commercial hip-hop and the soulless emptiness that inhabits some of its upper reaches. And this is where we get some of Shabazz Palaces' most interesting and very fanciful wordplay, like on Dawn of Luxor and They Came in Gold, going for this gothic, cosmic blend of fascination with decadence and death, with passing glances at Egyptian mythology and Afrofuturist concepts. It honestly reminds me less of Janelle Monáe or The Roots and more of all things, Warhammer 40,000, particularly in some of the darker iconography. And just like in that universe, the most gripping elements on this record are when real humanity is exposed. Now, I don't love the song #Cake, mostly thanks to some of the rhyme scheme, which just came across as lazy to me, but I do appreciate the attention it draws to the seductive allure of fame and simpler pleasures. And I also like that Noetic Noirmatics attempts a simple love song, even despite the harsh, imposing world seeking to strike down such introspective moments. And even though I do think Colluding Oligarchs is a song that does not work whatsoever on a compositional basis, probably the worst song on this album, at least for me, the combination of it and Suspicion of a Shape and setting out how an assimilated nightmare of how black culture can be ground down and stripped of its soul, that's pretty potent, and it sets up the 1-2 punch of the sixth suite of this album. The Break for Freedom and Mind Glitch Guitar TM theme and Motion Sickness. Hell, Motion Sickness is easily the best song on this record because it shows the consequences and inevitable doom for rappers at the end of their commercial peaks and success, and it gives the drama very real stakes, which is really appreciated here. And then Shabazz Palaces just completely whiffs that final hit on the last suite of the record. Now, I'm not saying that either of the two songs there are bad, but they don't nearly pay off the ending of the record nearly as powerfully or show anything beyond just a hazy spiral off into the unknown. Now, this was their moment for a thesis statement, something to draw this album together, this confused mess of a record, and it just does not pay off. I'm reminded of all things again, Year Zero by 9 Inch Nails, another record that went for a high concept and just completely whiffed it on the ending. And looking back on the rest of the album, yeah, okay, there are moments and there are concepts and there are lyrics here that I do really like, but they lack a grounding point, something to coalesce that album into this cosmic force. And what's even worse is that all it does is highlight that all the moments on this album that lack those interesting topics, or that force to, or just reiterate the same points with different descriptive language in the end. So look, I don't hate this album, or I don't even think it's bad. And with every listen, I did like it more and more, but it still doesn't break away from the fundamental problem that it just does not simply come together whatsoever. And a lot of the songs, they just don't stand up on their own. Yeah, there are great moments on this record, but I don't think they're enough to hold it together completely. Although they are enough to get me to cautiously recommend this album and give it a 6 out of 10. Folks, this is gonna be one of those albums that's gonna divide people, critics and the mainstream alike, and provoke a lot of discussion. So make sure to check Lese Majesty by Shabazz Palaces out. Just good luck figuring it out. This is not an easy record to crack. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. As you can probably tell, I've got a new lighting rig set up. If you got any comments on that or how the lighting might be better, please let me know. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve these videos, or if there's any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.